Clear skies above Memphis International Airport characterize April 7, 1994, a picture-perfect day for a leisurely journey. Yet, at around 3:30 p.m., there was an attempted takeover on board the plane, but no one was hurt. Suddenly, a McDonnell Douglas DC-10 freighter veers to the right, rolls to the left, and accelerates into a nosedive at over 860 km. The plane isn't meant for such speeds, but this is an emergency. A few moments later, the Air Traffic Control Center receives a terrifying transmission. You definitely don't want to cross paths with a plane hijacker, but security threats are far less obvious today. On board the plane, however, are 4 Federal Express employees, 3 of whom are fighting desperately for their lives. The hijacker is attempting to turn the plane into a missile. This is the insane story of the hijacking of Federal Express Flight 705 Music. Their flight crews typically consist of a captain and a first officer, but in the 1990s, the majority of commercial aircraft required a third crew member, the flight engineer. Auburn Callaway was scheduled to operate FedEx Flight 705, which was scheduled to depart from Memphis to San Jose on April 7, 1994, his crew exceeded their daily flying time limit, forcing another crew to take over the flight. Callaway, however, had to be on that flight. Fortunately, he was able to board the plane as a deadhead passenger, a position typically reserved for employees of FedEx, rather than sit quietly outside the cockpit, which was not his plan. On the day of the flight, he was the first person to board, bringing along a standard travel bag and a guitar. Andrew Peterson, a replacement flight engineer, arrived after him. Since FedEx employees frequently switched crews, Peterson didn't pay much attention to Callaway. However, he did notice something strange. The captain's cockpit voice recorder was turned off. Captain David Sanders and First Officer James Tucker arrived later, whereupon they greeted Callaway, prepared the cockpit, but forgot to close the door. Federal Express Flight 705 took off at 3 p.m. At around 18,000 feet, 26 minutes after takeoff, Callaway opened his guitar case, pulled out a spear gun, loaded it, and grabbed 2 hammers. Crowley's Ridge is the name of the mountain, and you can see the trees there. I'm familiar with the area, but I'm curious about the flat area beyond that, where you cross over. I'm also curious about the lack of the novaculite uplift, which is farther west. As soon as takeoff is complete, the multimeters will be set to 9s and 2s. Dave, do you live in Arkansas? Phil, are you a high roller? Firstly, Callaway hits Peterson several times from behind. Just as Tucker turns around to see what's going on, he swings a hammer into Peterson's left side of the head. Eventually, Tucker turns to Captain Sanders, who tries to defend himself but is overpowered. After the initial attack, Tucker's skull fragments pierced Peterson's temporal artery, and Peterson is bleeding out. Captain Sanders suffers from severe head injuries and an almost severed ear. The 3 crew members are in terrible pain and extremely disoriented, but they are all alive. Callaway returns to the galley to retrieve the spear gun as the crew takes a brief respite to recover. Sanders then slowly unbuckles his seatbelt and starts to stagger towards the door, while Peterson and Tucker regain consciousness. Captain Sanders rushes towards him as Callaway points the spear gun directly at him. Peterson grabs the spear before Callaway can pull the trigger. Tucker realizes he has a weapon he can use to fight back. The McDonnell Douglas DC-10 pulls back the yoke, putting it on a 15-degree slope. Callaway, Sanders, and Peterson end up falling through the door into the galley. As the battle rages on, Tucker, a former Navy fighter pilot who is now flying the plane manually, views the situation as active combat and decides that engaging Callaway directly is the best course of action because he is predictable when he is on the defensive. However, this maneuver hurts Sanders and Peterson, who are both losing blood and becoming weaker as the battle in the galley moves to the ceiling. Tucker rolls the DC-10 left by a 140 degree, nearly completely inverting it. During the chaos, Calloway hits Captain Sanders in the cockpit once more. Tucker's broken skull has paralyzed his right side, but that doesn't stop him from sending the DC-10 into a steep nosedive. The cockpit starts to shake, and the speedometer reaches 860 km/h, but the plane is going much faster. The DC-10 isn't meant for complex aerial maneuvers, so at this point, the elevator wings start to shake uncontrollably. Whether Tucker doesn't slow down or levels off too soon, the plane explodes. Just as the plane is about to crash, Calloway smashes into Captain Sanders' head, causing Peterson to lose a lot of blood. As Tucker steadies the plane, Sanders seizes one of Calloway's hammers and hits him twice. In the cockpit, Tucker calls out to the Air Traffic Control Center at Memphis International for assistance, saying, Sir, emergency, aircraft emergency, go." "Just a quick update. There has been an attempted takeover on Express 75. I need a vector, please." Tucker hears the fighting getting worse in the galley and quickly rolls the DC-10 to surprise Calloway. Express 705, which is currently eastbound, will be arriving at the airport at approximately 12:31. "Please keep talking to me. We need an ambulance and armed intervention. The airport facility will also be alerted. At this time, the pilot is approximately 8 miles north of Forest City, and he is attending to one OK contact. Meanwhile, Tucker is maneuvering the DC-10 from left to right, but Calloway is not. This is the most serious request a pilot can make, according to the monitor at the Air Traffic Control Center, which alerts the airport's emergency response team and radios Memphis Approach, who are in charge of landings at Airport 75. Captain Sanders finally manages to pin him down by hitting him over the head with all his strength. At this point, he calls Tucker to the galley and asks him to set the plane on autopilot. However, the plane takes off from Memphis Airport without anyone answering the radio. Did they subdue him or what? I heard some noise in the background that sounded like he had been injured, but he didn't shoot. Captain Sanders returns to the cockpit to return the plane to Memphis, removing all but one of Calloway's weapons. He asks for assistance in redirecting the DC-1 to Memphis, saying, "Express 705, heavy, yes, heavy, Memphis." If possible, he suggests going directly to Memphis, but even with Tucker's limping, he is shocked to see the room trashed and his crewmates covered in blood. Calloway is pinned to the floor. Here at 302 Niner, we have an emergency situation on our hands. We need security to meet the plane, either on the runway or at the airport. We have firemen, ambulances, and SWAT teams prepared to approach the DC-10 when it lands. However, there's a catch. The plane is over 16 tons heavier than the recommended landing weight, mostly due to fuel, and it has only been in the air for less than an hour. Usually, planes just dump fuel in case of an emergency landing, but Sanders is unable to safely reach the switches, so he will have to hoe. At approximately 7,000 feet, Sanders hears the fight getting louder from the cockpit, so he makes the difficult decision to level the plane, put it on autopilot, and kill Calloway. Luckily, Tucker had pinned him down again, so it wasn't necessary. But those few seconds made the landing even more complicated. The DC-10 remained at the same speed while the landing was underway. Now that landing on runway 9 was out of the question due to altitude and weight, Captain Sanders had to get creative and use runway 36 left, which was longer but perpendicular to him. In order to land safely on this longer runway, he would have to turn 90-degree right and make a sharp 180-degree turn while descending at breakneck speed. Finally, he would need to land the DC-10 smoothly enough to avoid bursting any tires and bring it to a stop before reaching the end of the runway. These maneuvers would have been challenging enough for a small plane, let alone an overweight Führer being flown by an injured pilot with a hanging ear and a... Within the cockpit, Sanders disregards the DC-10's warning systems, while in the galley, Calloway desperately reaches for a hammer that is on the floor. Fortunately, Peterson snatches the hammer from Calloway's grasp. He is extremely weak from blood loss, but summons all his strength and strikes Calloway one last time, stunning him for good. Miraculously, Captain Sanders lands the DC-10 without bursting any tires and brings it to a stop with barely 300 meters of runway remaining. The first thing the emergency. As the response team neared the DC-1, they placed Calloway in handcuffs. The crew was thankfully safe, and a potential disaster had been avoided. Peterson, who had lost so much blood and barely had a pulse, was the first crew member to be evacuated and rushed to a nearby hospital. Tucker, whose skull fracture had pierced his brain, had to be carried down the aisle in an ambulance alongside Sanders, who could hardly walk. Calloway was also taken to the same hospital, but he was heavily restrained on a stretcher, and he would spend the life behind bars. But why did he do it? Auburn Calloway came from humble beginnings. He attended Stanford University, where he studied African and African American studies. After graduation, he joined the Navy, where he honed his piloting skills and began a family. When his military career ended, he applied for a job at Federal Express, but they offered him a lower-paying position as a flight engineer. Calloway's life took a dark turn in 1994, when FedEx discovered that he had lied about the amount of flight hours he had on his resume when applying for the job. He was sure the company would fire him, but he didn't complain because he needed the job. A few years later, he and his wife got a divorce, and he continued to support their 2 children, even though his job didn't pay enough for them to go to college. After realizing he couldn't contribute financially to his children's education anymore, Calloway devised a sinister plan. On April, he was supposed to face a disciplinary hearing with FedEx, and he was entitled to a $2.5 million life insurance policy in case of a work-related accident. He believed this would provide his children with a better life than what he could offer them through honest work. If all went according to plan, Calloway's family would receive $2. The day before, he would sneak 4 hammers, a knife, and a spear gun onto a plane. He would then attack the pilot, take control of the plane, and crash it. When the wreckage was found, the crew's other wounds would look similar to the blows from the hammers, making it appear like an accident. On the morning of April 7, 1994, Calloway left his will on his bed, packed his weapons, and headed to Memphis International Airport. He was carrying a note for his ex-wife that read, "I would much rather go on a date-time place and a method of my own using I resolved some time." Despite needing to improvise the day before the flight, another crew would operate the plane, and he would have to board the plane as an extra passenger instead of 2 others. However, he was determined. "I learned long ago that the next time my safety and future are in grave danger, I will take action." The pilots, Peterson, Tucker, and Sanders, accomplished an amazing feat by safely navigating and landing the plane. This was especially true given that Tucker had to undergo 3 major operations and 2.5 years of therapy to regain her speech and mobility. Fortunately, none of the crew members were ever medically cleared to fly again. Despite their hardships, the ordeal brought them closer as friends, and in May of 1994, they were awarded received the highest civilian pilot honor, the Gold Medal Award for Heroism, from the Airline Pilots Association. At the same time, Calloway was found guilty of attempted aircraft piracy after pleading temporary insanity. He is currently serving 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Calloway's goal was to cause an accident, and many, including crew members, believe he would have crashed the plane into the FedEx headquarters in Memphis International, causing immense harm to the company and taking countless lives along the way. He was expected to have boarded the flight that day with his usual crew, a man and a woman, and it's reasonable to assume that he would have succeeded given his height, 6'2", martial arts training, and weapons. However, this crew went over their daily flight time limit by just 1 minute and 60 seconds. So Auburn Calloway, Andrew Peterson, James Tucker, and David Sanders were on board. It is only because of their heroic actions and that this tragedy has occurred. Interesting coincidence that nearly caused the worst airplane disaster ever.